Physiotherapists frequently receive dense electrodiagnostic reports, packed with pages of data tables that dictate a patient's prognosis. Misinterpreting these numbers carries immediate clinical consequences. If you treat a diffuse systemic nerve disease with exercises meant for a localized mechanical impingement, the rehabilitation program will fail. Consider a patient attempting to walk, but their foot drags heavily across the floor, presenting with an acute clinical foot drop. The core diagnostic challenge here is anatomical. Is this weakness stemming from a mechanical L5 radiculopathy in the spine, a fibular mononeuropathy at the knee, or the early stages of a systemic polyneuropathy? To answer that question, we have to look past the summary paragraph. The raw electrodiagnostic data provides a precise physiological map that must be decoded to build an effective treatment plan. Electrodiagnostic testing, or EDX, relies on two distinct technologies: nerve conduction studies, known as NCS, and needle electromyography, or EMG. Think of NCS as evaluating the body's transit highways. It uses surface electrodes to test large fiber sensory and motor nerves, mapping out distal or symmetric neuropathies. Needle EMG, conversely, evaluates the power stations. By inserting a fine needle directly into the muscle belly, it assesses deep proximal nerve segments and spinal roots that remain inaccessible to surface electrical stimulation. By combining the distal transit data from the NCS with the proximal output data from the EMG, a clinician can track a deficit upstream and pinpoint the specific segment where a nerve lesion occurs. This diagram illustrates the output of a motor nerve conduction study, the compound muscle action potential. The first metric is amplitude, measured as the peak's vertical height. Amplitude correlates directly to nerve integrity, representing the volume of axons successfully depolarizing to the stimulus. A recorded drop in amplitude indicates true axonal loss. The physical wires inside the nerve bundle are severed or dying off. Moving along the x-axis, we measure distal latency and duration, which track the signal across time. Latency and conduction velocity measure the efficiency of the myelin sheath, reflecting the speed of saltatory conduction as the electrical impulse jumps between the nodes. Prolonged latency and slow velocity point to demyelination. The insulating sheath around the nerve is damaged, even if the core wire remains completely intact. However, testing technique heavily influences these numbers. If examiners use submaximal stimulation, they fail to recruit all available axons. Here, a submaximal stimulus yields a 3.5 millivolt wave, mimicking severe axonal loss, while a supermaximal stimulus yields a healthy 17.5 millivolts. The primary rule for reading an NCS is straightforward. Amplitude loss indicates structural axonal death, while slowed velocity indicates a demyelinating injury. Nerve conduction studies have a major limitation. Surface stimulation cannot reliably assess conduction blocks across deep proximal plexuses or spinal roots. To diagnose a radiculopathy, we rely on needle EMG. Instead of stimulating the nerve directly, EMG observes how individual muscle fibers react when they lose their nerve supply. The electrical signature of the muscle reveals the timeline of the injury. Acute denervation triggers spontaneous, erratic firing, known as fibrillations. Chronic damage alters the physical shape of the motor unit action potentials, as surviving neighboring nerves sprout new branches to reinnervate the orphaned muscle fibers. This lumbosacral plexus diagram maps nerve roots to muscles, letting clinicians reverse engineer injury locations. If the tibialis anterior shows denervation, the lesion can be anywhere from the ankle to the L5 root. Testing a second L5 muscle, like gluteus medius, pinpoints spinal lesions. By utilizing EMG myotome mapping, a physiotherapist can safely shift their treatment focus away from a distal symptom in the leg and target the true source of the compression at the proximal spinal root. Even with precise anatomical mapping, electrodiagnostic testing remains highly susceptible to environmental artifacts that create physiological illusions. The most common technical error in the EMG laboratory is performing a nerve conduction study on a cold limb. Low tissue temperatures alter ion channel function and slow acetylcholine esterase activity. This biological reaction artificially drops the nerve's conduction velocity. These tables and waveforms compare a sensory nerve under two conditions. At a normal 34.2 degrees, peak latency is 2.7 milliseconds. At a cold 25.8 degrees, latency delays to 3.2 milliseconds. The cold waveform visibly stretches right, falsely increasing the latency measurement. The clinical consequence of this error is severe. This temperature artifact perfectly mimics the diagnostic criteria for a demyelinating polyneuropathy or carpal tunnel syndrome in an otherwise perfectly healthy nerve. Before accepted to diagnosis of demyelinating disease, verify that the limb temperature was recorded above 32 degrees Celsius for feet and 34 degrees for hands. We can organize these physiological principles into a streamlined 3-column interpretive matrix to guide rehabilitation strategy. An axonal profile, marked by low amplitude on the NCS, dictates a slow prognosis. Recovery relies on actual physiological fiber regrowth, requiring a long-term focus on functional adaptation and compensatory strategies. A demyelinating profile, marked by slow conduction velocity, implies a potentially rapid functional recovery. If the myelin sheath heals or the underlying autoimmune trigger is resolved, the nerve can quickly resume normal transmission. A radicular profile, identified by myotomal denervation on the needle EMG, shifts the physical therapy focus away from the limb entirely, prioritizing spinal stabilization and nerve root offloading. For the rehab professional, a completed electrodiagnostic report operates as a biological blueprint. It dictates the pace, limits, and exact anatomical targets of the entire recovery plan.